Well, welcome to this webinar on the move to NPP. We're going to focus today particularly on discussing the RBA's risk assessment, which is certainly a topical development and one in which there's a lot of interest across the industry. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're here in Sydney on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and acknowledge their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, but also the custodians of the land across Australia where you may be joining us from. I think my panel here today requires very little introduction. Ellis Connolly will be known extensively to you as the Head of Payments Policy at the RBA, and we're delighted to be joined by Luke Wilson, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the Australian Payments Network, and of course Katrina Stewart, who is the Executive Sponsor of the Move to NPP program at AP+. I'm going to hand over now to Katrina, who's going to walk us through a brief introduction and scene setting on the key pieces of work that we're involved in, and then return to a panel discussion with our guests.
Thank you, Adrian. Just moving on to a bit of an update on the Move to NPP program of work that we wanted to go through this morning. So our key areas of focus are really about ensuring that the platform has the right capability in place and the capacity and the account reach that's going to be required to successfully transition more payments over to the NPP. And we're going to touch a little bit on some of those key areas this afternoon. But also we're focused very much on governance and coordination. Most recently, we stood up our external Move to NPP steering committee with an independent chair and really working together with others across the industry to ensure we've got the right governance and coordination in place to ensure a successful transition of payments to the NPP. Resilience and contingency is obviously also a key area of focus, and we've got some planned work later on this year to really sort of dive into that in terms of different scenarios and what that's going to mean as we think about the contingency arrangements and how that will operate on the NPP. So we'll have further updates on that later on as that work evolves. And then how we just focus more generally on the industry change management effort and supporting banks and customers and end users and others to transition their payments over to the NPP. So we wanted to provide a bit of an update on what our kind of sort of roadmap looked like as it relates to the Move to NPP initiatives. And so at the end of last year and further consultation this year, we've confirmed a number of items for delivery at the end of 2026 with the annual release cycle for the platform. And that includes some identifiers to help support payday super, which includes having the payroll and qualifying earnings date included in the payment message, and also the ability to identify a payment as a refund. Those message enhancements aren't required to support the implementation of Payday Super, but in our discussions with industry, we felt that these were enhancements that would be made that would help smooth the processing of payments using the NPP, and particularly in relation to refunds as well and how that might operate. We're also looking to introduce some further enhancements to the Pay-to messaging as well by including ultimate creditor and also the ability to identify different merchant types within the payment message. And then more broadly, at the end of 2026, we're looking to upgrade the ISO 20022 message version that the NPP operates on. So the platform went live back in 2018 on a version of ISO from 2014, and now it's really time for us to uplift that and avail of some of the improvements to the ISO message structure that have come in place in the interim years. There are also a number of other elements of capability enhancements that we're looking to further consult on. One is around the inclusion of batch identifiers and using those to help support the grouping of transactions, particularly for payments that are typically submitted in bulk. A process to support bulk returns in the event that those need to be returned across the platform. Looking in particular at a standard payment instruction format. So today, many organisations submit their payments using the ABA file. As we think about payments moving to the NPP, how do we have an NPP equivalent that captures all of the data that's required in a standardised format and can be used as a replacement for that ABA file? And then finally, as we've discussed previously, continuing the work around developing a service to more efficiently process large volumes of bulk payments on the NPP. And so that work is progressing to a detailed design phase and kicking off imminently this year. In terms of capacity and reach, those are other kind of key areas of focus as well. So from a capacity perspective, we did an initial uplift at the end of 2023 to ensure not just that we have sort of sufficient average throughput capacity, but have we allowed for sufficient headroom as well for those processing peaks that we know happen at certain times. We are looking to deliver our second uplift at the end of this year, and we'll continue that as well as we progressively prepare for more volumes to come across the NPP, and having about 6 times the kind of headroom between our average throughput and what that kind of maximum headroom looks like as well. And then from an account reach perspective, that's an ongoing area of focus. So based on our latest data, we have about 114 million accounts that are now reachable for NPP payments. There are another sort of 10.5 million or so that are planned to be made reachable over the next couple of years. And then there's a small slither of accounts that currently aren't planned to be made reachable. And those are predominantly sort of a lot of legacy products or products that sit on legacy infrastructure. But we're working very closely with our member banks in terms of what their individual strategies are to ensure that from a customer perspective, the transition is going to be seamless and that customers can continue to both receive and make NPP payments from their portfolio of accounts. Moving on, we just wanted to touch a little bit about kind of what we're seeing from a kind of migration perspective. So increasingly as more businesses and end users are thinking about what the transition means for them, what are some of the different pathways that they have to transition their payments? And that kind of really is a spectrum of options, starting on the left-hand side with what might just be a kind of sort of lift and shift type of approach. So businesses might choose to continue to operate, their payments as they do today, continue to submit an ABA file to their banking partner or their payment service provider and have those payments converted into NPP payments. Their back office processes would remain largely unchanged, and it means that there's a lower kind of change effort required. It does mean that some of the full benefits of the NPP may not be fully realised at that point, but it also provides a kind of starting point for organisations to come on board and then think about what their kind of payments modernisation journey might look like over time. And then at the sort of other end is what we're kind of calling lift, shift and uplift. So a number of businesses are actually taking the opportunity to think about how this presents an opportunity for them to uplift their payment processing to really leverage the NPP's capabilities fully. And so they might start to decide to actually move away from file submissions and move, say, to APIs, for example, to submit their payments. Thinking about how they can receive payments using our Pay2 service, thinking about how PayID can be utilised as a way for payments to be processed as well, rather than relying just on BSB and account numbers. And also thinking about confirmation of payee and how that capability can be leveraged, not just from a kind of retail banking customer's perspective, but also how does that capability apply in like a bulk payment scenario as well. And whilst that might require sort of higher change effort for businesses up front, it means that they're likely to realise some of those benefits earlier. But for any of the options that businesses or government agencies or other end users choose to take, it's likely to be a sequence and a kind of staged approach as well for them in terms of thinking about where to start, where are the areas of benefit for their organisation that they want to focus on first, and then how does that evolve over time, and really also taking the opportunity to start to pilot, do proof of concepts, to test and learn as well. And we're increasingly seeing that happen in the marketplace today. And then in terms of the RBA risk assessment, which the RBA published just back in March, that had a number of recommendations for industry to focus on in terms of how we think about this transition. And our initial focus together with AusPayNet is very much around the 5 foundational recommendations that were contained in the report. So how as an industry do we develop a vision for account-to-account payments? What does that look like? The work around what are the options around kind of BECS decommissioning and in terms of what that really means from an industry perspective. How do we ensure we've got the right mechanisms and forums and processes in place from a decision-making perspective? And very critically, how are we hearing the voice of the customer in terms of the end-user engagement that is happening and needs to occur as we think about this program of work? How do we ensure that we've got the right forum in place for governance and coordination? And then as we think particularly about the development of our bulk service, as I talked about earlier, what are the success criteria that as an industry we're going to use to basically determine what is the right design for that service and how we need to move forward from that perspective? So that's just a bit of an update on the Move to NPP program and where we are as of today. And now I'll basically hand back to Adrian to kick off the panel discussion.
Thanks, Katrina. That was a really useful update on where we are today, and you've given us a great primer to leap off from in terms of discussing some of the key recommendations that the RBA has outlined in its risk assessment for the closure of BECS. And so maybe we might start there. Modern, efficient and secure payment systems are increasingly important to Australia's economy. From the RBA's perspective, why is the move towards modern payments so important, and how does the RBA see its role in supporting and driving this change across the industry?
Thanks very much, Adrian. The payment system is essential for the functioning of Australia's economy. We all need to be able to have confidence that our payments are going to be made reliably, securely and efficiently. Now, as technology and community expectations evolve, naturally, the payment system too has to modernise. So in the context of account-to-account payments, we can see that the community really appreciates the additional speed and convenience that comes, say, with NPP payments. There is a need for more data-rich payments to be available, so more processes in our economy can be automated. And there's also new services such as Pay2, which has the potential to unleash a new wave of payments innovation. And then there are also services such as confirmation of payee, which can help to make our payments safer from fraud and scams. In terms of the RBA's role in this, our mandate is to promote the safety, efficiency and competitiveness of Australia's payment system. Given the importance of account-to-account payments to all of us, we see that we have a role to oversee this modernisation process to make sure that it's being conducted in the public interest.
Excellent. So you've outlined your perspective on the importance of a modern payment system for Australia's economy, and you've talked a little bit about your mandate and the RBA's mandate in seeing that through to fruition. If we turn to the risk assessment on the decommissioning of BECS, what are some of the key areas of focus that you've outlined in that assessment? And what's your assessment of the current state of play?
Absolutely. So we embarked on this risk assessment and we found some significant challenges with the approach industry had taken to the decommissioning of BECS. And as Katrina highlighted, there were a series of high priority recommendations that we've put on the table for industry to address. That first one is that the industry, along with support from the government, needs to formulate a vision and some strategic objectives for the future of Australia's account-to-account payment system. Basically, we all need to have a common view of what success looks like. What are we moving towards here? Another key point was that a whole bunch of options need to be assessed as to the best way to achieve that vision. And as part of that options analysis, end users need to feel like they've been involved in the process. And of course, any big program of work like this is going to need appropriate governance and coordination. So we've emphasised that the industry will need to establish a centralised forum to be able to coordinate this migration, which is an enormous program of work. Now, the good news is AusPayNet and AP Plus are making progress on these recommendations, particularly around setting up the centralised forum. Nevertheless, it's early days and there's lots and lots of work ahead. We would encourage the industry to be focusing on delivering a future account-to-account payment system that meets the needs of all end users in Australia. And the target date for when that gets done is not the primary concern. It's more important that we get this right.
Thanks. Katrina, turning briefly to you, what's your perspective on where industry's at
I think certainly we're seeing increasing momentum, and I think one of the benefits of the target date was it really kind of helped to frame for industry what we were sort of moving towards. I think when we look at the RBA risk assessment and the recommendations that were contained, there were a number of areas that we're planning for or already have in our program of work that we know as an industry we need to resolve and we need to work through. Particularly things like contingency in terms of how that's going to work. And I think having the risk assessment at this stage in the program of the multi-year sort of program that we have is a really kind of useful steer for us to make sure that we have on our radar all of the different areas that we need to focus on. And I think coming back to Ellis's earlier point about sort of having the vision and then from that developing a roadmap with milestones, it'll be very clear to us in terms of how we are progressing over the years. Where do we need to focus greater effort? What are some other sort of challenges maybe that come up that we need to address along the way? So I think for us it was really encouraging that a number of the recommendations were already kind of in train from an industry perspective and gave us a really kind of clear pathway ahead in terms of as an industry what we need to do together with AusPayNet as well.
Thanks. And I might just pause here to just reflect that we will have time for some questions at the end from the audience. So please put them into the chat and we'll see if we can get time to answer some of those. And as we have with all of our other webinars, we will circulate a list of some answers to questions that we didn't get around to answering in this format. So watch out for that. Luke, turning to you, why did AusPayNet decide that it was time to decommission BECS?
Well, I think a number of the themes have already been touched on. Modernisation, the importance of payments to the economy, in particular the importance of account-to-account payments to the economy, but maybe some more specifics underneath that might help answer the question. So Treasury released their strategic plan for payments where modernisation and in particular upgrading of systems was a key priority. We also know that BECS has been around since the mid-90s. It has significant limitations in its fundamental design, so its format, its message format in particular. But also over that time there's been other account-to-account options and there's a growing overlap of capability. So there's a fundamental investment question for participants in the industry as well. So a couple of those things are really important because they link in with that modernisation theme. Also, after significant consultation, our members told us that what we've been good at is we've been pretty good at in Australia adding things, but not necessarily having a plan for those older systems, and we need to have a plan for that. And they felt that based on the importance of modernisation and the benefits of other systems, that there's an opportunity to look at the strategic future for BECS, and that's when that date was set. Katrina, you talked about that date honing the focus. It certainly has done that. And the date was also set with a number of accompanying priorities and focus areas like viability, capability, adoption, cost of change, cost of run. So there's a lot of similarities in the themes that were identified by our members in setting that date, but the themes that are in the risk assessment. The risk assessment probably is more up to date, obviously based on timing, and contains a bit more information. But I think that's really, they're the key drivers. Plus, the other important factor to consider is that our members felt that BECS is not going to be fit for purpose longer term. So it's not a system that can be left as it is today. It's seen to be highly likely that significant investment would be required in BECS if it was to remain the long-term account-to-account payment system of choice for Australia.
Which I think certainly aligns to some of what we heard sort of during that process in terms of the industry wanting to say we have a modern payments system today. Let's focus on what we need to do with that and uplifting of that system and not having to kind of invest in two in parallel. And I think also what we're seeing from an end user and a kind of business and corporate perspective is a desire that they want to be able to transition their payments across and start to avail of some of that modern capability, particularly around things like payee validation, about payment certainty, about the fact that it is always available, and not for them as well to kind of operate two systems, but actually to simplify that and to streamline it. So just moving on to another one of the key recommendations, which was about really further examining the alternative options for BECS. And what's the benefit from an RBA perspective, Ellis, of doing that work? And then maybe I might get you to comment on that, Luke, as well, in terms of what your plans are to take that forward.
Thanks, Katrina. As part of the risk assessment, we did a lot of stakeholder engagement, including with end users, and quite a few were asking us, why is BECS being decommissioned? From their perspective, it's been a very reliable workhorse system, and they're happy with its level of functionality. So some stakeholders were unconvinced that industry had sort of fully analysed the net costs and benefits of maintaining BECS in some way versus migrating. So given that there's not that there are people in the stakeholder community that are not convinced, it would really be worthwhile for industry to assess whether BECS should be retained and be very transparent about that process. Because really it is essential for end users to be able to understand the net benefits of a migration, because there's costs, there's central costs, there's costs for financial institutions, but there's also costs for end users potentially in upgrading their systems for a new account-to-account payments future. And it'll really help the end users to be able to develop their own business cases to get the investment funds they need if there's a really strong case as to whether or not BECS should be retained.
So, Luke, from an AusPayNet perspective, what is the plans to take that work forward in the coming months?
So first of all, I think it's probably worth noting that we welcome the opportunity to work with AP Plus and our members and key stakeholders on addressing the risks that have been raised by the RBA. Obviously, one of the key focus areas is on that options analysis. It's also worth noting that the target date for BECS was set a couple of years ago, and some time has passed, and we need to refresh that view. Specifically, we also feel that it's a great opportunity. Who are the experts in this area? They know how account-to-account payments work. They know how their end users are using account-to-account payments to contribute to the next steps, and specifically for us, that's a focus on those options. We have had some options that we've talked to members about through our initial consultation and through bilateral conversations. Since then, we will do some further analysis of those options. We will take those options through multiple stages. So that first stage is via our Payments Review Committee, which is a subcommittee of our board, and we will do some internal analysis of that based on the feedback we've got from our members first off. I think really importantly, and I know we're going to get to the ACCC authorisation in the conversation hopefully in a little while, but following that, once we've gone through that initial assessment of options, we've socialised that with our PRC, we've socialised it bilaterally with our BECS members. Ultimately, we want to take it to that coordinated forum, which is a roundtable forum, which will be made up of AP+, AusPayNet, Treasury and the RBA, and where BECS members and key stakeholders will have an opportunity to represent their views.
Great. Thank you. We've touched a little bit on kind of the public interest and why that's important, and that was certainly a very strong key consideration that came out of the RBA risk assessment that needs to be thought of as we think about the decommissioning of BECS. But maybe kind of expanding a little bit more on some of your earlier comments, Ellis, what does that really mean in kind of practical terms, and why is it so important to kind of have that lens as we think about the work forward?
Absolutely. Look, in general, the public interest is about payment systems operating in a way that benefits society as a whole rather than any private interests. In the context of account-to-account payments, we want to see the development of a future account-to-account payment system that meets the needs of all end users. I mean, that's the essence of the public interest. In terms of breaking that down into some components, we think you need a future account-to-account payment system that's fully accessible for end users from their accounts with financial institutions, that's capable of supporting the use cases that end users need to deliver payments, that's affordable and also is reliable, safe and secure. So we really think it's very important that the industry focus on delivering these public interest objectives. It'll help build trust and then give end users the confidence to be fully utilising the system.
Mm-hmm. And I think it also kind of comes back to really maybe sort of articulating the benefits that the platform can avail to end users within the frame of kind of those public interest considerations and what that actually means. So, Luke, you mentioned ACCC authorisation, and so AusPayNet and AP Plus did put in an application to enable us to work more closely together as part of the BECS decommissioning. And with interim authorisation coming through just late last week, which obviously was a great step forward, what in your mind does that mean in terms of kind of the coordination and the collaboration that that's going to enable? And what are some of the immediate areas of focus?
Yeah, getting interim authorisation on Friday was great, a fantastic step forward, because when you're dealing with a topic like this that has so many users of the system and so many interested parties, we need to make sure that we can hold conversations with the right level of legal protection, fundamentally. And that legal protection and being able to coordinate those discussions will make what we're trying to achieve for the betterment of the payments ecosystem far more efficient, we think. So rather than having individual organisations going out to a similar group of stakeholders, a similar group of participants, and possibly asking crossover questions or for reporting and information, we can do that in a more coordinated way. We still need full authorisation, which we expect in July, hopefully, but the interim authorisation is a really positive step. So I guess the first thing is that it enables the process to be run more efficiently, in a more coordinated manner, hopefully deduping a lot of requests for information and engagement that we would otherwise have to do. So that's the critical thing so far.
Yep, great. Adrian, your perspective on what you're hoping to see from an AP Plus?
I think it'll really turbocharge our efforts in working together in a coordinated way. As Luke referred to, being able to engage with end users as far as possible, and it won't always be practical or desirable, but as far as possible to engage with end users together. But also speaking with one voice to government together. But I also think it's logical. In the main, these payments are moving from one system in the main to another system. So it's logical for the two operators of those systems to be able to work together in a coordinated way to manage that transition and to help to address the risks that arise from that. So it's an important next step.
Definitely. I think at least in terms of being able to share information and you know, sort of what the outcomes of some of those conversations are and being very coordinated around that.
So maybe we can just pick up a little bit more about the end user consultation, the end user engagement that the RBA has done. As part of the risk assessment, Ellis, you referred to the fact that you've spoken directly to a number of end users of the BECS system. What insights came out of those conversations for the RBA, and what are end users saying about their expectations for the future?
Thanks, Adrian. Yes, we consulted widely with end users, both from the government and the corporate sector, including utilities, retailers, miners, the super industry, so quite a broad range of users of BECS and account-to-account payments. We really heard they're very focused on getting value for money. So they want their payments to be reliable and secure, and they're also quite used to them being low cost. So I think those are the key components of value for money that they're focusing on. Some of the end users, as I mentioned earlier, were unconvinced about the need to decommission BECS. Some of them, in terms of the use cases that they're involved in, didn't value, say, the additional speed that comes with an NPP payment, particularly the ones that are involved in doing bulk payments. Quite a few of them were pretty happy to trade off a batched payment with low cost. So I think it's an important issue for the industry to be thinking about. We also heard that end users had received some inconsistent messaging on BECS from their payment service providers. It's not that surprising. Different payment service providers are approaching the issue from different perspectives. They might have different migration plans, and they're at a different stage of readiness themselves in terms of being able to offer services. So in that context, it's not surprising that they've been hearing mixed messages from their payment service providers. So in this context, we think it's really important that the payment system operators and administrators be able to engage directly with end users as well. So far, that's been really only in large forums, rather than being able to sort of go directly to end users and engage with them. And that's because historically, these relationships were seen as being the responsibility of the financial institution. We think going forward, it's going to be really important for payment system operators to be able to directly engage with end users to make sure that their needs, their use cases are being taken into account in the development of the central infrastructure.
Luke, have you got a perspective about how AusPayNet will engage with end users going forward?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we acknowledge that end users of the system need to understand what's happening with their payments and why it's happening. I agree that view is super important in creating a vision and doing options analysis. I think it's equally important. We've talked a lot about deduping and efficiency, and I think we need to apply the same lens to a degree to that process. So we are fully on board with end users and key stakeholders being engaged in this process. BECS touches just about every active account in Australia, so we need to be conscious of that and the impact of it. We need to take their perspectives into consideration. I think there's a role for us to play with our members, ensuring that both, a clear view is created and collected from end users, but we also need to understand what the providers of those services are doing with their end users, and there needs to be a level of alignment there. There are some end users out there who probably are shielded from what type of account-to-account payment products and services are offered to them by their service provider, and we just need to keep that in consideration. So overall, I think it's super important. I don't think we can get to options and a vision without taking it into consideration. I just think we need to work through the best and most efficient way to do that and take into consideration the different types of solutions that providers are going to put out in the market.
And Katrina, so AP Plus has been engaging to some degree with end users, particularly I think with intermediaries and digital platforms, but also some end users in particular in relation to particular kind of industry verticals like superannuation. What's AP Plus been hearing from end users in the last 12 months or so?
So I think certainly there's a lot of curiosity around better understanding the benefits of the NPP and really trying to understand what does that mean for different segments, for different kind of use cases, and particularly really trying to understand a little bit more some of the efficiency benefits, particularly in terms of, when you have unhappy path and payments that actually fail, actually what can the NPP deliver in terms of back office efficiency improvements and what that really looks like, and understanding what the experience of others have been as well who've come across to the NPP. I think there's also a really kind of keen desire to look at how does sort of the payments modernisation journey fit together with other things that are happening across the economy, like something like payday super being a perfect example, in terms of if there's broader change that's coming in, is there an opportunity to then think about what that means for the payments element of it as well, and tying those together. And I think that kind of really then comes back to end users wanting to understand more about what does this really mean for them from a change effort perspective, and what are some of those options in terms of how they can think about migrating their payments. And as we kind of touched on a little bit earlier, kind of those spectrum of options and the sequencing and how they can think about what that journey might look like for them, and really trying to start to plan and break that down now to kind of work out what their individual roadmaps are going to be. And I think working closely with the market to help sort of provide information to support people think through that, and particularly across different use cases, and understanding the particular needs and requirements of different segments as well as we think about what the NPP needs to support is going to be really important.
Excellent. Last question, kind of quick fire. Looking ahead, 12 months out, what do you hope that we've been able to achieve as a result of the RBA's risk assessment? Maybe starting first with you, Luke.
Well, from a process perspective, we hope it's an efficient process. Then from an outcome perspective, subject to ACCC's full authorisation, we hope that we have an agreed vision for account-to-account payments in Australia. We hope that we have a preferred option, or at least a very short list of options, and we hope to have a roadmap and a path to achieve those options.
Excellent. Ellis?
Oh, that sounds good. What Luke just said. If we can get
What he said.
Exactly, I'll have what he's having. We'll get the vision together. That's really, really important. And then we can move on to having some well-governed milestones and provide some visibility for end users. I think maybe that's the only bit I'd throw in there as well.
Yep.
Visibility for end users, so everyone can have the confidence to invest in the future of our account-to-account payment system.
Any last comments on that question?
I think just to add to that, I think then also how does the NPP bulk service kind of feed into that vision and that roadmap, and also some of the other capability that we're looking to have some further conversations around from an end user perspective to really understand, as we think about the NPP in 5 and 10 years' time, what does it need to look like?
Well, that's a great segue to a hot topic in the chat. Katrina, tell us more about bulk processing on the NPP. I mean, obviously there's more work to do in terms of engagement with end users, in terms of the detailed design. What do we know about bulk files? What do we know about bulk payments on BECS? And what's the kind of path forward? In at least at a kind of thumbnail sketch about how we're going to make bulk capability available on the NPP.
Mm-hmm. We'll in about 1 minute.
You have 2 minutes.
That's right. So over the last kind of 12 months or so, working closely with industry to look at kind of bulk payments, we've really kind of learnt a couple of things. One is that whilst a number of end users typically submit their payments as a kind of bulk file today, if you actually look at the number of payments that are within those files, they're typically actually containing maybe about 10 payments or less. And so actually there is the ability for the banks or the payment service provider to continue to ingest those files and debulk them into single NPP payments. But there's also a proportion of bulk payments today that contain a significant number of payments. And they might also have some specific requirements in terms of, sort of processing time, how quickly those payments need to go through and the funds be available in the recipient's account. And how, as an industry, do we think about the most efficient way to process those payments and those high volume of payments across the infrastructure between the banks that are sending them and the banks that are receiving them? And also, as we think about, in the event of an incident or an outage, how from a contingency perspective is effectively kind of taking those payments and being able to group some of them together to send to the receiving bank going to be a more efficient way to process them. So there was agreement with industry at the end of last year that we would look to develop a bulk service, which effectively would look at how some of those payments can be grouped together into a single payment and passed through to the receiving bank. So a multi-credit transfer message, as we call it, that would make that a more efficient way to process those bulk payments across the platform. But it's not necessarily a service that's going to be needed for all payments as well. And so we are looking to start to really get into a more detailed design phase to really look at, technically, how does that service work? What are different end user requirements that we need to take into account when we think about that service? What are expectations around things like processing time and SLAs, and what would the end user receive back as well? What does that look like, and how does that feed into their kind of back office processes from things like a reconciliation perspective, to really kind of sort of agree with industry on the detailed design for that service. And we're hoping to get there by the end of this year so that then we have clarity around what's required, both in terms of the development from central infrastructure perspective in the build, but also for member banks as well in terms of what they're going to need to do in their own operating environments.
And do you think there's likely to be a trade-off there between cost and timeliness that as Ellis called out?
I think definitely. I think it's one of the key considerations in terms of do we need to look at a different kind of price for that service, because maybe the service features will be different from what we see today, and so maybe it's not payments getting processed in a minute, but maybe it's within an hour or whatever the appropriate time frame might be, and how does that kind of get balanced with some of the cost considerations as well.
as well as things like recoverability from an outage,
Yes.
which is something that the industry is increasingly being asked to reflect on. How does the NPP recover from a multi-day outage in the same way that BECS does, and is that comparable? Is that right?
and how do we quickly get back up and running as well?
Right.
It's about that recoverability and the speed at which, as an industry, we could do that, and how that service would help support from that perspective.
Another question, Riaz. The costs of NPP transactions are significantly higher than BECS, especially for second-tier FIs. How can the industry address those cost implications in order to encourage the migration off of BECS? That's a really easy question for you, Katrina. I might ask you in a second about cost, Ellis.
So, I mean, given the kind of NPPs operating on a cost recovery basis, as we see more volume come across, with it looking at how does that kind of transaction cost come down over time, which we've seen, since the NPP went live, it's come down considerably from kind of 39 cents in the early days to, kind of sub 5 now. And what does that look like moving forward? I think it's also looking at what are some of those kind of cost efficiencies as well that can be unlocked, because if people can reduce the manual effort within their back office environments, that's going to save money as well. So I think we need to be careful that it's not purely a kind of like for like comparison, just purely on the unit transaction costs, but what else comes into play there as well. But certainly, we are very, conscious of the fact that the unit cost needs to represent value as well for end users, and how they can see that value. I think coming back to some of the earlier comments.
And you set yourself an ambitious goal of trying to peel back the layers of the onion and understand more about end user pricing for NPP transactions in the risk review. What did you learn?
It's really hard to do. I think that was our first discovery, measuring the cost of account-to-account payments isn't something that's been done before. So we had a first go at it last year, and that was our key finding. And we're going to be developing some forms for the industry to fill in this year, which will be a bit more comprehensive. We need to get better at this to be able to give end users the information they need. What's clearer, rather than the end user pricing where there's more work to be done, is that the wholesale pricing between NPP and BECS, but it's not really a fair horse race between the two. You've got BECS, which is, to some extent, fully depreciated infrastructure running on a very low per transaction cost, up against NPP, which is new infrastructure. I think we have to unearth some of the hidden costs of BECS. There's a lot of manual processing associated with it, and that's real. And hard to measure, but a substantial cost. And the other thing is, can BECS run the way it is between now and forever? Probably not. It will probably need further investment to be able to remain fit for purpose. So then you've got to do the horse race, then also taking into account the additional functionality of NPP, but what would the true cost of BECS be in terms of some of the hidden costs and the cost of making it fit for purpose if it was going to continue to run.
And presumably this is something that AusPayNet's going to stare into when kind of comparing, BECS today versus a kind of BECS for the next 50 years as against the NPP. Is that right, Luke?
Well, we historically stayed away from cost and pricing because of competitive related issues, but we know that it's clearly a top priority for users of the system, whether they be participants in the system or end users. So at some point in time through this process, if you're going to get to a vision and agreed options, you need to address the underlying costs of the system and how that cost translates to users of the system.
And very last question to you, Katrina, and you did touch on it before briefly. With many payroll and other providers having to deal with multiple banks to pay wages, super and PAYG payments to the tax office, what is AP Plus doing to ensure a common format that can be provided by every bank to minimise the effort and speed uptake of the NPP, as well as the interchangeability of kind of payments processes? For example, a replacement for the ABA file.
Yeah, so as we touched on earlier, it's one of our key areas of capability enhancements that we're currently working on and looking to further consult on as well, to understand the kind of views of different end users. I mean, certainly from what we have heard from a number of organisations in the market, and particularly those who are kind of key intermediaries like payroll providers or ERP providers, is the importance of having a consistent format, because then you can basically install that once, you're not having to, really kind of focus on how they integrate with different sort of bespoke formats. And so we have been having a number of conversations, particularly with the digital service providers in terms of what might that look like. But it's a really kind of key area of focus for us moving forward to really understand what are the views of the market and end users as it relates to that. But kind of consistency and standardisation has been a key message that we've heard a lot in our conversations around the importance of having them.
And just one more. Just unpacking the disconnect or the connection between payday super and bulk processing. Is bulk processing needed to enable the NPP to process transactions for payday super? And are there banks today that can debulk files?
So the answer to the last question is yes. There are banks that can debulk files today, and there is not a dependency on having the bulk process service in place in order for the NPP to be used for payday super. And we've spent quite a lot of time sort of talking with industry around that as well, and particularly again with the kind of payroll providers and others to make sure we fully understand that. But we don't see that as a dependency. So the NPP can be used for payday super today.
Excellent. Well, I won't sneak any more in at the last minute. Thank you. Thanks to Ellis and thanks to Luke. It's been terrific to have you along here with us. We've nearly 1,000 people registered to watch this webinar, so you are our most popular yet. And thanks, of course, to you, Katrina. We will be sending out a link for this webinar so that you can share it with other people in your organisation. And as I mentioned, we will also be just summarising the questions that we were asked and the ones that we didn't get asked, and just giving you some brief answers in relation to those. There were lots of questions, but we didn't get to all of them. You've heard from Katrina and particularly from Luke about the work that we'll be planning on doing over the next few months, particularly now having interim ACCC authorisation in place. And some of those are highlighted here. So over the next few months, we do intend to kick off a consultation process with end users and other key stakeholders on a few things. Firstly, the future vision for account-to-account payments. Secondly, requirements for that new service that Katrina talked about that will enable the NPP to cater for large volumes of bulk payments that may be processed within a single message. And thirdly, some additional NPP capability enhancements, including the one that we just spoke about, which is a standard payment instruction file. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's been great to see such interest in this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at our next one. Thanks.